thank you so much. It's great to be in London, and this is my first WinOps, so I'm really excited to be here. I think you sounded way cooler introducing me than I would introduce myself, so that was perfect. But has anyone heard of the State of DevOps Report? Oh, wonderful. Okay, so I started this 8 years ago, back in 2012, before DevOps was really a thing. No one really knew what it was or understood anything about it or even really anticipated what it would become today. And I think probably like many of you who've been around in the tech space have seen lots of tech buzzwords come and go. You probably thought, like I did, it'd be dead in a year, right? But here we are today, and we are still talking about DevOps. And in fact, I've spent the past 8 years doing this DevOps research, surveying over 33,000 technical professionals from all over the world, and working with the larger DevOps community, with our Puppet customers, to really understand how organizations are adopting and scaling DevOps practices today. It's been really fun being able to dig into this research. And in a couple of hours, we are about to launch our new State of DevOps report. It's the 2019 report. And this year's report is entirely focused on one of the most challenging aspects of DevOps today. That's integrating security practices into the software delivery lifecycle. And as you all know, security is often seen as a necessary evil, but it doesn't have to be that way. And this year's research really shows us that integrating security throughout the software delivery lifecycle can actually deliver real results and positive outcomes, even if the path isn't entirely straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to get into the boring demographic stuff here for a bit. So we try very hard to make sure that we have global representation, because a lot of our respondents historically have come from North America, and that's not always the most representative group to look at. So we try to make sure that we go and get feedback from places all around the world. Same with industries. We target a broad swath of industries. Technology and financial services are always the top two that come up, and then industrials and manufacturing, retail, media, et cetera. We always like to look at also a broad range of roles within an organization, because you start to see really interesting differences. So for example, last year when we looked at the C-levels and compared them to the on-the-ground practitioners, the perceptions of how they were doing were vastly different. So it's really interesting from a segmentation perspective. And then as far as departments go, 52% from IT, no surprise there, 38% from dev or engineering departments, and then 8% from information security. And we made a concerted effort this year to gather feedback from InfoSec teams. And then as far as teams go, again, there's a wide swath of teams here, so I won't go into all of them. But why is it so hard to integrate security into the software delivery lifecycle? I know you're all, yeah, exactly, that's why. I mean, I really believe it all comes down to how people are incentivized to do their work. And in my other DevOps talks, I talk about this a lot. But what is the incentive for doing security well?
GDPR, 1% of global revenue.
Exactly.
4%.
That's so exciting when you say it like that. It's, when things are going well, nobody cares. Nobody notices. It's only when there's an incident that people actually sit up and pay attention. And if there is an incident, what are the actual consequences? Maybe an executive gets fired. The company might have to pay some fines. The stock price might dip for a second, but usually it just shoots right back up. So really, we have short-term memory when it comes to these security breaches. I mean, there are all these incidents that have happened, but it hasn't really changed any of our consumer behavior. There haven't been any real lasting negative repercussions as a result. So good security doesn't pay the bills, but what does pay the bills? Customers, new features, right? Delivering value to customers faster. And that's kind of the inherent problem with DevOps and how people are incentivized. So DevOps teams are incentivized to deliver new features faster so they can get to market faster. They can get that competitive edge. But good security doesn't give you a competitive edge. Okay, so why should we even care about this in the first place? Like, besides the obvious reason of, safeguarding our customers' data and all of that, there is a reason that businesses should really care about this. So according to the study from IBM, this was many years ago, but I think this still applies. It costs 6 times more to fix a bug in the implementation phase than it does in the design phase. 15 times more to fix in the testing phase, and 100 times more once that code is running in production. So common sense should tell us that building security in from the start is just a good business practice. Yet, we continue to make the same mistakes over and over again by bolting on security and quality at the end of the life cycle. Okay, so I don't want to minimize how hard this is because this is really challenging, right? Our friends at Snyk, I don't know if you know Snyk, they're a really cool little software company that focuses on container security. Very cool people. They just published their State of Open Source Security Report. I highly recommend downloading this. Do any of you use any open source components in your software? Just thought I'd ask. So it's a really great report. So not only are the number of vulnerabilities growing exponentially, but most of them are also found in indirect dependencies. So good luck finding those and fixing them. Furthermore, most of the developers on these open source projects, they are not implementing sufficient testing to catch vulnerabilities. And even if they are aware of a vulnerability, it can take them up to 2 years to actually put the patch in. I'll let that sink in for a little bit. So I was talking to, just to bring this home, one of our customers, and he was telling me that they can only fix about 10% of their vulnerabilities. And I've looked at other research, and this is totally normal because there's a ton of heavy manual processes involved, lots of bureaucracy, and because the business never wants to take down the application because it's a revenue-generating application, that means it can take 90 to 180 days to actually get a window for them to patch. Has anyone experienced that? All right, good times. So how do we actually solve this problem? Well, we've seen these really successful patterns emerge from DevOps that have really enabled organizations to build deployability, quality, testability, all of that into the delivery lifecycle. And there are also a lot of organizations out there that are actually successfully baking in security from the start. I know a guy who runs the entire DevOps initiative at a major airline, in fact, the one I flew in on this morning. And he was telling me that he brought in the security from day one from their initiative. They were so bogged down with all this manual work, and they couldn't really spend any time doing really innovative work. And so they were excited to be on board. Now, I think that's the exception here, but it still pays off because ultimately the security team is one of their biggest advocates. So I'm going to be referring to levels of security integration a lot throughout this presentation. And the way that we define those levels was by asking people to select all of the different phases where security was actually involved. And then we broke those answers out into 5 different levels. So level 1, no integration at all. They're not really collaborating with security unless there's something wrong in production. Level 2 is they're doing 1 of 5 phases. Typically, people start with testing according to our data. Level 3, 2 of 5 phases. Level 4, 3 or 4 of 5 phases. And then level 5 is integration across all the phases in the software delivery lifecycle. Make sense? Cool. Okay, so that's how we're going to orient all this stuff. So we found that 60% of firms include security in 2 or fewer phases of their software delivery lifecycle. So levels 1, 2, and 3, that's about 60% of the sample population. And so what that tells us is that most organizations, they aren't at a very high level of integration today. All right, so I'm going to jump into the findings now. The first finding is doing DevOps well enables you to do security well. And I can totally see from your faces that you're all like, yeah, obvious, move on, right? But just to put a fine point on it, most research actually just exists to prove what you already know. So there you go. So if you've already started on your DevOps journey, good news. You are building the capabilities that will actually enable you to deliver more secure software. So the use of version control, continuous integration, automated testing, automated deployments, that is an amazing foundation to build all these other capabilities on top of. It also makes it so that any security-related change, you can treat that change just like you would any other change that's happening in your system. So last year, I don't know, did anyone read the 2018 State of DevOps Report by any chance? It was very long. This new one is also long. I tried to make it short, but failed at that. So last year, we did something totally different, and we wanted to really look into what the evolutionary cycle looks like for a DevOps transformation. And so we uncover that there are 5 stages in that model. And at the most advanced stages of evolution, what we found is that there's a high degree of automation for security policy configurations, incident response, and the security team is really deeply involved early on in the technology design and development. So we also wanted to know if this works the other way around. And as you can see from this trend line, what this is showing is each of the levels of integration, and then the line itself is the percentage of evolved organizations. So at level 5, 22% of highly evolved organizations also have a high level of security integration. All right, second finding, cross-team collaboration builds confidence in security posture. So as security becomes more integrated, your team's confidence in their security posture actually improves. So we found that 61% of respondents that have a high level of integration felt that their security policies and practices actually improve their security posture. And if you compare this to firms that with no security integration, the level 1 in red right there, just 38% had that same level of confidence. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are more secure. What's important here is that this is a major shift in mindset. So when teams are not integrated at all, they tend to be a little suspect of the work, right? A little cynical. And I'm not going to name any names, but a few of my authors really did not want to even broach the subject of security because they were so cynical about it. But when teams are fully integrated, there's a shared understanding, and people feel like the things that they're doing actually matter, and so they're more likely to actually do those things. So we looked at a bunch of different practices to see which ones would improve security posture or confidence in security posture. Any guesses as to what kinds of practices those were? I'll tell you. So we threw in a bunch of practices, right? We just wanted to see what would come out of this. And I personally thought for sure that it would be the really tactical practices, things like security testing, you know, the stuff that you have to do, that would kind of make it to the top of the list. But me and my fellow authors, when we saw this, we're like, huh. And then we were just delighted and surprised by this list, because if you look at all of them, the thing that they all share in common is that they require a really high degree of collaboration. And this collaboration is happening early on in the delivery life cycle. So the top 5 practices: security and development teams collaborate on threat models. Is anyone doing this today? Well, I think this is fascinating that this came up as number 1, because this is so early in the life cycle. This is like in the planning and design phases. And one of my authors, Mike Stonke from Circle CI, he's the VP of engineering there, he says they do threat modeling all the time, and it's a really worthwhile practice for them. And it requires a lot of collaboration between the dev and security teams, oftentimes bringing in other teams as well. Security tools are integrated in the development integration pipeline. This is a huge enabler for devs. You know, they can then go find the vulnerabilities as they're building the code, fix them immediately, get that feedback loop going, and be empowered to make those changes. Security requirements are prioritized as part of a product backlog. That includes both functional and non-functional requirements. Infrastructure-related security policies are reviewed before deployment. This is super important because this is when the InfoSec team and the operations teams are working together to review those security policies, and they're able to spend more time thinking more like an attacker. And then security experts evaluate automated tests. So they're actively, on an ongoing basis, evaluating these tests, working with the testing team, with the dev team to make sure that the tests are reflective of what's going on. Okay, so we mapped all this out in a quadrant, and the x-axis here represents the importance of the practice as it relates to confidence and security posture, and the y-axis is the frequency of these practices. So I would suggest that everything on the left you should just think of as table stakes. These are things that you should be doing anyway. Pen testing, dependency checkers, static code analysis, those are all things that you need to be doing, even though they're not super impactful for confidence and security posture. Those are still important things to do. Everything on the right, though, is where you should focus your efforts, and these are the things that require collaboration, as I was talking about. So here what we're seeing is it is not just about shifting some security checks over to the left. It's actually about changing how we work together to collaborate really deeply and early in the life cycle. So our recommendation is to focus on this lower quadrant in pink right here, because those are the practices that are really impactful, improve your security posture, but also are infrequently used. So everyone can work on those. Okay, so this is all great, feel good stats so far, but you might be wondering, does this have any actual impact on the business? Well, that is one of the things that we wanted to test, one of our main hypotheses, and we did find that integrating security leads to positive outcomes. Okay, so this year we asked about deployment frequency, as we always do every year, but we asked two questions. So the first one was, how often can you deploy? And the second question was, how often do you actually deploy? So at this point in time, we know enough organizations who are actually able to deploy more frequently than their businesses or their customers even require. And if you think back to a couple years ago, this is a far cry from a couple of years ago when everyone was obsessing about deployment frequency. And I think it's actually a huge measure of success for your DevOps initiative if you are deploying so frequently that your marketing team has to tell you to stop because they can't keep up. I think we should measure that. So okay, if you look at this teal green bar over here on the left, you can see that at level 5, full integration, 61% of those respondents are able to deploy on demand compared to 49% at level 1. That's a significant difference right there. Also, time to remediate critical vulnerabilities. This is also a super important metric. And I want to point out a couple of really interesting things here that struck me, because it took me a while to kind of wrap my head around this one. So first of all, only 7% of the total respondents are actually able to remediate a critical vulnerability in less than an hour. The majority of the respondents, so here in these two groups right here, are able to deploy in less than 1 week. So this is 1 hour or less than 1 day to less than 1 week. So that's where the majority fall. So the main takeaway for me looking at this is, the differences between each of the levels, they are statistically significant, but they're not that dramatic. I would have expected it to be a little bit more dramatic, but it's not. And I think the reason for this is that it is actually really hard to shrink down that time to remediate critical vulnerabilities because this process is so challenging. There are a lot of manual approvals, a lot of handoffs, manual processes. All of that contribute to the fact that this is really hard to do. So that's why you're seeing not very dramatic changes here. So now, just imagine for 1 minute with me that you were asked to choose between making a security improvement or delivering a critical new feature that your customers have been asking for the last year that will help you make your quarterly number. Which one would you choose? Raise your hand if you would choose the security improvement. Oh, tell me what teams you're on. I think most people would choose feature delivery, right, in this situation. And we asked a series of questions like this, and what we found was that the firms, once again, at the higher levels of security integration, were actually more effective at prioritizing those security improvements over feature delivery. So that's the blue dot. You can see it follows a very similar pattern for all of the different questions that we asked. Okay, now stick with me again. So imagine that you're about to push out said new feature to production, and then you discover a serious vulnerability, a serious security issue. What would you do? Who would stop the train? Okay, that's better. Yeah, I think thankfully most people would actually stop the train. I think there's probably a small segment of the population who would just push it to production anyway and then deal with it afterwards. We've all seen that happen. But here the main takeaway is that at the higher levels of security integration, once again, they are able to more effectively stop the train. Okay, so I've painted a really rosy picture so far of all this. Great business outcomes, confidence and security posture, all of that. But the reality is that security integration is really messy, especially in the middle stages. So, I think this is classic. When you're just starting out, you really don't know what you don't know. And then you start to uncover all this hidden complexity, all the Band-Aids and the glue and the duct tape that have held this thing together for so long. And when you start unraveling it, it gets really messy. So, we've seen this in past reports too, and this is what we call the J curve. So things start out pretty well because you have some quick wins under your belt, you're getting all that low-hanging fruit, and then you start to hit some of those harder problems. You hit that complexity wall, and then things tank for a while, and then you start to get back up on the upswing. So that's called the J curve, and we've seen that in other reports as well. Okay, so we asked if security teams encounter friction when collaborating with delivery teams. And the friction gets higher and higher at levels 2 and 3, and it never really goes away. And friction, when you're working with people, there's always going to be some sort of friction involved. And what's interesting here is if you compare the non-security roles to the security roles, you can see that for those people on the security teams, the friction is a lot higher and it's sustained for a lot longer. So I think it's really important to understand that DevOps is fundamentally about culture change. And it's imperative to remember that different teams will feel that change differently. So anyone here, manager, leader in the organization? Yeah, so really important for you to be aware of this change and how it's affecting your teams differently. Okay, so one of the big reasons we hear for not integrating security is that it'll slow things down. And again, here at level 3, we see it kind of peak, and people really do feel that their speed of software delivery is being constrained by this security integration. So yes, it does slow things down a bit. But if you look at levels 1 and 5, they're about the same, so it's not really slowing things down any more than it was before, and you're actually better off because you have security now built into the process. So we think the outcome is actually pretty clear here. And then audit issues. We actually covered audits quite a bit in the report. I didn't put a lot of it in here, but increasing security integration isn't going to reduce the number of issues you find in audits. And that's typically because what we found is that the people who are at the higher levels of integration, they're actually doing more audits per year. And oftentimes these audits are elective, and you can actually select the level of difficulty for the audits. So we suspect that in these higher levels, people are actually doing more audits, and they're harder audits. So that's just painting a picture of how messy it does really get. There's more in the report. But to wrap up, I want to leave you with this. This is a quote by Edward Deming, many consider to be the godfather of DevOps. And I love it. I use it in all of my presentations. But learning is not compulsory, but neither is survival. So organizations that want to survive, they have to learn from the mistakes of the past. And they have to fundamentally change how they work and how their teams work together. And this is as much a mental shift as it is a shift in technical practices and processes. And it's really important to understand also that every team is going to feel this shift differently. And so we need to be there to support them. So thank you. And the report drops in a couple of hours. It's 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, so not too far from now. Any questions? You all ready for beer? Yeah.
Still got a panel to get through. Were you able to segment the company size?
We didn't segment by company size. We are going to segment by vertical. So we have a set of reports coming out that's vertical oriented.
Cool.
Yeah. We also have I think we're going to do a salary report. We may do another. There was so much data that we could actually do a couple more reports from it.
Could you speak to any interesting trend you've seen over the years of the reports?
DevOps teams growing. So we started tracking that way back in 2014, and I think DevOps teams made up like 16%, and then it grew to 24%, I think last year, or 26%. So that was an interesting trend. Also see the trend in job titles following that. I think the companies are getting better and better at a few key performance metrics, things like deployment frequency, change failure rate, and then the other thing that's interesting is that we start to see the high performers moving away from the pack. Yes?
On all of the graphs, you see sort of a level 3 where sort of it gets really bad. How often do people sort of go from that just back to level 1 just because it's easy and they've
I
used
wish
to?
I knew. That is such a good question. But I think there's a point of no return. You know, you've already invested all this in your DevOps initiative. You've probably restructured your teams. You've invested in new tooling. So I think at that point, it's kind of like you have to keep moving forward. But I wish I had more data on that. Very good question. All right, thank you. Oh.